Thank you all for coming today. My name is Bruce Barnes, and I'm a member of the New Bedford Preservation Society who's sponsoring this tour. Normally when we've had tours in the past, we've had very large groups, but we have a very limited group today because we have a restriction on 10 people to come on the tour. But thank you for coming. This is our second version of the VIP tour. And we're going to talk about 8 individuals that had an impact on the city. And we're starting right here at the head of Union Street with the Abraham Russell House, which is no longer here, but is very historic in its own sense. The Russell family was the first family to settle in what is now modern-day New Bedford. A number of families started moving into this area around the early 1700s, and the Russell family was the first one. They were, for a family that was primarily farmers, even the early Russells were very entrepreneurial. Russell's Mills is the progenitor of the family that moved here, and they had built a grist mill on the end of where Russell's Mills now at the end of the Pascamanza River. So even though the early Russells that came to New Bedford were primarily farmers, they also did a little bit of whaling, they did a little bit of shipbuilding, a little bit of coastal trade, so they weren't completely just farming community. So the second generation of Russells, which included Abraham Russell and Gilbert Russell, they were very entrepreneurial. And they finally got capital to express themselves in a bigger business when they started selling lots to the Nantucket whalers that moved in here in the 1760s. So Abraham Russell was born in 1756, died in 1837. And he built a very large house right here at the head of Union Street. It looked like the Mariners' home. Really, it was very similar to the Mariners' home, William Rotch Jr.'s first house, a large 3-story Federal-style building. That was sort of the preferred style in New Bedford until about 1820. There were lots of big mansions that were built during that time, but and they all looked about the same. These large 3-story buildings, fairly plain, reflected the Quaker taste and so forth. Russell was always described in all the literature that I've read about Russell was that he was very flamboyant and a risk taker. He did a lot of, I guess, risky investments. He married, though, the connection between New Bedford and Philadelphia, even in these early years, between the Quakers in the early areas of New Bedford, the Roaches, even the Russells, the Rodmans, all those early families, they had a very close relationship to Philadelphia. Now, there were other Quaker communities in the area. There was a big Quaker community. Obviously, the whole community of Nantucket was Quaker. Providence, Long Island, Newport. But Philadelphia was the mecca of Quaker life, and that's where a lot of the relationships between the early settlers in this area had connections. And Abraham Russell's wife was named Sarah Schumacher, and she was from Philadelphia. They were married probably around 1780 or so. So Russell builds this big house, and he starts investing in whaling ships and all kinds of things. And one of the things he invests in, or decides to do, is to establish a stagecoach line. This is in the 1790s, a stagecoach line from New Bedford to Boston. Now, that would seem like a fairly simple thing to do, but you have to realize that the stagecoach drivers had a 16-hour trip. The tickets were 6 cents, the trip cost 6 cents a mile, and it took 16 hours. The stagecoach was going to leave at 4 o'clock in the morning and not get to Boston until 8 o'clock at night. That was the general schedule. So, and there was 3 trips a week to Boston, 3 trips back from Boston to New Bedford. That was the schedule. But when you set up something like that, you have to change horses probably as many as 5 to 8 times. It's a long trip. Horses can't last that long. People have to stop. So the drivers had to know how to change harnesses and so forth. So Russell sets all this up, he buys his first 4-horse hitch. Nobody in New Bedford knows how to hitch a 4-horse hitch. Nobody. They have this 4-horse hitch. He's got the business started, or he hopes to start. Nobody knows how to do a 4-horse hitch except his wife. His wife is the only person in town who has hitched 4 horses when she lived in Philadelphia. So she takes the drivers into her kitchen, lays out the harness. Very interesting story. Lays out the harness and teaches the drivers how to hitch and unhitch and really hitch the horse, because they have to do this all the way. They probably changed drivers as well at some point because it's such a long ride. But anyway, it was an interesting story. This story is absolutely, it's almost a whole chapter of Daniel Rickinson's History of New Bedford, which he published. He found the story very odd and interesting himself. Abraham Russell, as I said, he was flamboyant and a risk taker. And around 1815, he owned all the land around here, probably all the way down to maybe even Rockdale Avenue. But in 1815, he was broke, and he couldn't pay the mortgages on the land. The Roaches owned the mortgages and took over the property, actually, before they foreclosed on the property. They let him keep the house, but they foreclosed on the property. James Arnold, who was a son-in-law of William Rotch Jr., he purchased these 11 acres here and built that house in 1819. That's why that house is there now. Now, in the early 1830s, late 1820s, the city decided that it was going to extend Union Street, and the Russell house was right in the way. So they decided they were going to move. They weren't going to demolish the house. They were going to move the house, and they moved it 400 feet straight back to the corner of North Orchard and Cottage Street. This was like this move of this house was legendary in its time, because apparently they didn't take the furniture out. They didn't do anything with the chimneys. The move was so easy, according to legend, that even the clocks didn't stop ticking. This is what's true. This is a legendary move. The guy who made the move was a very important carpenter, house builder by the name of Dudley Davenport. He was a legend in his own time, really. He built this house. He built a lot of the early buildings, and he orchestrated this move. Now, Joseph Grinnell, who was another very famous New Bedford person, his daughter married one of the daughters of Abraham Russell. So he had intimate knowledge of this, and Grinnell was also very friendly with John Quincy Adams. And John Quincy Adams, in his diary, mentions this particular incident, where the house was moved 400 feet, the chimneys weren't, nothing was ruined. It was just like they picked it up and dropped it on site without any damage whatsoever. Anyway, kind of interesting stories about Russell and the family. The Russells were very, very, when whaling came here and all kinds of businesses started, the Russells were all in. When you see the early shipping list and the ships that have been being built as early as the 1780s, the Russells are involved. So they are just as important as some of the other famous families in the early development, the commercial development of the city. Our next VIP in front here of the great Friends Meeting House, built in 1822, is Elizabeth Rodman. Elizabeth Rodman was born in 1757 and died in 1856, 99 years. She was married to Samuel Rodman Sr. She was the daughter, I should say at the start, of William Rotch Sr., perhaps the most important Yankee whaler in history, actually, and her brother was William Rotch Jr. So she was born into wealth, she married into wealth, and she had 9 children between 1781 and 1794. And her children, the legacy of her family in New Bedford is really unmatched, actually, for one person, one family. This Rodman family, which was also really a strong part of the Rotch family because their grandfather was William Rotch Sr., was so instrumental in the early half of the 19th century. And I'm just going to rattle off some of the things and some of the people that I mean here. Samuel Rodman Jr., that big mansion we just walked by, very, very famous whaling merchant, diarist. One of the daughters married Charles W. Morgan, Sarah. Charles W. Morgan, very well-known whaling merchant, banker. His namesake ship is the classic and everlasting, hopefully, relic of the whaling industry here in New Bedford. Her daughter Anna married Andrew Robeson. The Robeson House is the big mansion across the street from the Visitor Center. Andrew Robeson was a pioneer in the textile industry in Fall River, as well as being a major whaling ship owner here in New Bedford. Another son is William Rodman. He is the one of the Rotch Rodman House at the head of Hawthorne Street on County Street. We're going to stop at that location today, a little later on, actually, to talk about somebody other than William Rodman. Her son Benjamin Rodman was one of the biggest landowners in town. He owned the land where the Wamsutta Mill is, all the way up Linden Street. He had his mansion was actually off Linden Street, where the County Street extension is now. When you go down County Street, then you have to take that left for briefly, and then you continue on County Street. That's his original driveway. His estate, which was all wooded at the time, that part of County Street was his driveway. His house was about 50 yards in from Linden Street, and he owned all that land out there at one point. He sold his land on the waterfront to the Wamsutta Mill because they wanted that site because there is still a freshwater pond, large freshwater spring-fed pond next to the Wamsutta Mill, which is called Rodman's Pond, after Benjamin Rodman. So, and the legacy in buildings in New Bedford is enormous. Not only the houses, but the Rodman Candle Works, Fort Rodman. Benjamin Rodman's son was the highest ranking soldier in the Civil War from New Bedford to be killed in action. Anna Robeson's grandson was also killed in the Civil War at Gettysburg. So these people were very, very active, very committed. And the matriarch of the family was Elizabeth Rodman. And she was she wasn't just somebody that had a big family. She did have a big family, but she was also active. And her story here at the Friends Meeting House is very important, because in the 1820s there was a big controversy in the Quaker religion. There was a preacher who had come up with a new way to experience what the Quakers, which was central to their religion of the inner light. And this preacher, his name was Elias Hicks. He was from Long Island. He came up with a new way and a new series of dogmas, and he even challenged some of the tenets of the Protestant religion itself. And it was very popular with some segments of the Quaker community. And Elizabeth Rodman and her sister Mary Rotch were two of those people who thought that the new lights, as they call, was something that we should embrace here in New Bedford. They had one of the nice things about the Quakers in these early years. They had great virtues, humility, pacifism, service, philanthropy. But one of them was equality. We all know that the Quakers were abolitionists, were very strong abolitionists in New Bedford as well. It's one of the reasons why New Bedford's a stop on the Underground Railroad. But the other part was the freedom that women had to participate in the church. They were not only encouraged to participate, but to speak outside of if they were excellent speakers, they could speak outside, and they were given permission to travel to other communities and speak about how they received the inner light. When I've talked about Rachel Howland in the past, she was one of the most important New Bedford preachers really in the 19th century. So Elizabeth and her sister Mary Rotch invited a woman preacher from Lynn by the name of Mary Newhall to speak about from the Hicksite point of view. And they had hoped that she would speak not only once, but perhaps for a series of times, maybe for 5 or 6 weeks. After she spoke eloquently and almost inspirationally the first time, the elders of the church said, no more. And you know, she can't speak anymore. Mary and Elizabeth weren't too thrilled about that. Now you have to realize, 1822, Elizabeth is 66 years old. She's not like she's, you know, she should be retired, you know what I mean? But she's not. And Elizabeth and her sister actually stick to their guns, and a few months, this is in 1823, and a few months later, reluctantly, but they were so persistent in their pushing the Hicksite views that the elders of the meeting disowned the couple, basically threw them out of the meeting. When you realize how important the Rotches and the Rodmans were, this had to be a very, very difficult decision to make, because they had funded basically the building of this new place. They funded the Friends Academy, which was right up the street on County. I mean, so, you know, to do this, they had to really, really feel strongly about what they were doing, but they did so. The Rotches, most of the Rotches and most of the Rodmans left the meeting as a result of this disowning of these two ladies. So they were very brave, and showed that when they were committed, they were committed to the end. Because I don't think really they ever really stopped being Quakers, although most of them went to the Unitarian Church. Samuel Rodman Jr., he became an Episcopalian. There was an Episcopal church right behind here on the north side of Union Street. And he was one of the few that became an Episcopalian. And eventually Samuel Rodman and his daughters actually built the Grace Church on County Street now. So anyway, Elizabeth Rodman, very, very interesting person. Her family was most instrumental during her lifetime, even because she outlived many of her children. And so, any questions about her or? The house behind me is called the Gibbs Mansion, but the person that we're interested in, I'm talking about for this house, it was a man by the name of Joseph Wing, W-I-N-G, Joseph Wing. He lived in the house from around 1860 to his death in 1895. And he and his brother, William R. Wing, they were the last of the big-time whalers. They were, you know, in other tours, if you've been, I've talked about how when they discovered oil in Pennsylvania, that was the end of certain parts, really, of the big-time commercial whaling, because petroleum was going to always be cheaper, easier, and better for the most part than whale oil was going to be. But that didn't mean that whaling disappeared overnight. Quite the contrary, actually. It lasted. The last wooden whale ship left New Bedford in 1926. So the Wings didn't even get into the whaling business until the 1840s. They were originally a retailer of clothing and whaling outfits for the whalers that were shipping out. That was their original business. They made enough money, they started investing in whale ships. And by the 1870s and 80s, they had a fleet of about 12 to 15 vessels, one of the biggest fleets that was ever owned by anybody, actually. And they primarily did their whaling in the Atlantic, but they also had some whale ships that went into the Arctic. After the Civil War, the main high profit part of whaling was to go whaling into the Arctic oceans of primarily the off the coast of Alaska and Siberia. They were looking for bowhead whales, primarily for their baleen, which was a high-priced commodity at the time. And so that's what they were doing. And the Wings did a little bit of that as well. They owned the Charles W. Morgan for a long period of time. At the last quarter of the 19th century, for about 25 years, the Wings owned the Morgan, and the Morgan was based in San Francisco and mostly whaled off Siberia for quite a few voyages. But the Wings they were the last of the big time whalers. Joseph died around, I think he died in 1895, and his brother continued on. Before I get to that though, just to show you how the whaling industry didn't really pass that quickly. New Bedford had its own Wall Street Journal of whaling. It was called the Whaleman's Shipping List and Merchant's Transcript. Came out once a week. This was such an interesting newspaper. the publishers whose name was Lindsay, there was two Lindsays, Henry and then his son Benjamin, or maybe vice versa, Benjamin then Henry. They would compile a list, alphabetical list by town of every single whaler that was whaling at the time. Now, when the paper started in the 1840s, there were probably in the country 500 ships that were whaling. And they had a list of every single ship, where it went, where it was, what it had on board already. It was unbelievable how they could deal with so much detail on a weekly basis when you consider that, you know, there was no internet back then. All they were using was notices from ships returning. When ships, there was a lot of meetings at mid-sea. When people came back, they would report to the newspaper. So it was quite a thing. Now, I looked at an issue of the whaleman shipping list for 1883. You know, 25 years after the oil was discovered in Pennsylvania, just to see what what was the activity going on. And in New Bedford alone, there were 90 ships registered in New Bedford, still whaling in 1883. So, and granted, 50 of them were in the Pacific Ocean, based in San Francisco, and 40 of them were based in New Bedford still and whaling in the Atlantic Ocean. And the wings were primarily, well, they had 12 or 15 of those 90 ships, which is a pretty high percentage actually. So anyway, they continued to whale. Joseph retired. His brother continued the business. He was sort of the last dean of he was the dean of New Bedford whaling merchants in the early 1900s. But he died tragically in a carriage accident when he was riding in his carriage with his 10-year-old grandson, and the carriage flipped and killed them both. It was front page news, and it was a very, very tragic event in the city at the time, because Wing was, you know, he was revered as the venerable old whaler, and to die so terribly was unfortunate. Now this house, this is a nice house, which has been completely ruined, really, by the dormer on the second floor. You see, when you look at this house, there's some big additions to the house too, but the facade of this house, without that dormer, is very admirable. It's a beautiful house. Check the big giant windows on the first floor. That is very, very unusual. It's a high style, federal style house at the time. But that one big giant dormer at the top completely draws your eye to it, no matter how you look at this house. And really, it's a shame that it was allowed to happen, because it's a nice federal style house. The big hipped roof house, very, very beautiful building in its time. Nonetheless, and even the nice portico entryway, it's original to the house. That's not an add-on, but we can do. Doesn't take much to really spoil a nice facade. The house behind us is the home of George Howland Jr., one of New Bedford's most celebrated citizens in his own time. His father was a very, very successful whaling merchant here in New Bedford, and George and his brother, Matthew Howland, inherited the business in 1840. George Sr. Lived until the 1850s, but the brothers took over the business in the 1840s. And George Howland Sr. was a millionaire in his time. And $1 million in the 1830s was a considerable sum. So the brothers were born into great comfort, and they inherited a very, very successful and ongoing whaling business. George and Matthew Howland was the business from the 1840s on. Matthew was the guy who ran the counting house. He's the guy who set up the ships, bought the ships, outfitted the ships, counted the money when it came in, distributed the oil, whatever it did. George was the front man. He was the guy who was the politician, worked as whatever people asked him, he did. He was mayor of New Bedford. He was in the state legislature. If he worked on any number of government projects when asked. He was a kind man. They were both they were one of the ones that stayed with the religion. They didn't leave the religion during the schism in the 1820s like the Rotches did. They stayed. They were they were committed Quakers, abolitionists, everything. And George is always described as a very amiable and nice person. So, but he got himself into a little bit of trouble in 1863. He was mayor of New Bedford, and this is the middle of the American Civil War. And the Civil War at that time is not going well for the North. They've had a terrible catastrophe at Fredericksburg at the end of 1862, and recruits are way down, and Abraham Lincoln decides to institute a draft. And it's not popular even as legislation, but it's even less popular because many of the troops that were killed during the terrible events at Fredericksburg were Irish regiments from New York City. They were massacred in a crazy attack, like a picket charge attack at Fredericksburg in December of 1862. So Lincoln enacts this, and the legislature, the Congress enacts a draft. But it's not, the numbers aren't called until the summer of 1863. And when the numbers are called, New York is riot. The draft riots in New York in the summer, in July of 1863, are the most violent and destructive civil disturbance in the history of the country. Over 200 people are killed during the draft riots. Hundreds of buildings are burned down in New York City. The authorities have absolutely no control of the situation. They actually have to call back regiments from the battlefield at Gettysburg to quell the violence in the draft riots. Horrible situation. Well, here in New Bedford, there's rumors that agitators are going to come, and there's draft riots in other cities as well, mostly in New York State. And there's rumors that agitators are coming to New Bedford in the summer of 1863. Well, George Howland Jr., pacifist, Quaker, and his sister-in-law, Rachel Howland, comes to him and says, "What are you going to do, George, if the people come?" And George says to her, "There will be no blank cartridges fired," which means he will use deadly force to keep the peace in New Bedford if the agitators come. That had to be a huge moment for him, because it worked against everything he believed in and his upbringing and so forth. But he was willing to sacrifice all that. It was a big thing. It was a profile in courage, in my view. No agitators came. There was never any draft riots, but he was prepared to make that call, probably against everything he believed in. Now, the Howlands, George and Matthew, the whaling business went great for many years. After the Civil War, they transferred all their assets to the West Coast because that's where the big money was in the Arctic whaling. They built a brand new ship called the Concordia, spent $100,000, maybe the most expensive wooden whaler ever built. Had it contracted so it would be all reinforced because of the ice conditions in the Arctic and so forth. Anyway, the whaling fleet goes up to the Arctic whaling grounds in 1871, and the entire fleet is lost, except for a handful of ships which rescues the rest of the people. But of the 42 ships that go whaling in the Arctic that year, 35 are lost, and all the ships that the Howlands sent are lost, including the Concordia. They lose $300,000 in this disaster. It doesn't break them, but it's a huge blow. 5 years later, in 1876, the same thing happens again. It's a freak of weather nature, what happened. And I won't go into details, but it's a freak of weather nature. In 71 and in 76, that the ice flows would trap the whalers as they did. They lose their fleet again in 1875, and this does bankrupt them. They have these huge estates. This estate owns the whole block here, up to 7th Street. Matthew Howland's estate on Hawthorne Street, where the Walkowitz house, the Walkowitz dental office is now, He owned all, not only that property there, but all the land between Hawthorne and Grove Street. That was all Howland land. They had huge estates. They had a huge number of servants and and staffs and stuff to run these places. They couldn't even afford to pay for their estates. When Matthew dies in the early 1880s, he has to sell his entire estate. They won't even allow Rachel to keep the house. Rachel is kicked out. She is so bitter about that. When you read her letters about this, she's very bitter about being thrown out of her own house by people that she knew and grew up with. George also, in the late 1880s, he has to sell his property as well. Dies penniless because of they just can't keep up with the payments on their estates. When he died in 1892, he was born in 1806. When he died in 1892, the newspaper couldn't have been more praiseworthy of this man, Howland Jr., because he was such a good man. He would do anything it was asked of him for the city and for the country at large. He worked on a number of national efforts as well, but at least he was remembered fondly when he passed away in 1892. But nonetheless, he died penniless after being a wealthy man almost all his life. Now, a VIP here is Frederick Shirley. And we have on the tour today the expert on Frederick Shirley and Mount Washington glass, Kirk Nelson. So Kirk's going to do the biography of Mr. Shirley. Thanks, Kirk.
Woohoo! So I'll just say a few things about Shirley. Of course, in New Bedford, whaling gets a lot of the popular attention. But in the 1870s and 80s, it was also, the city was called the art glass capital of the country. They had a big glass industry here, primarily one factory. In the late 1860s, a group of glass workers from Sandwich on Cape Cod came to New Bedford, built a beautiful state-of-the-art factory right down on the water. They were exceptionally good craftsmen. They were really bad businessmen. And the factory failed almost immediately. A few years later, an old glass company from South Boston called the Mount Washington Glass Company relocated to New Bedford, took over the works, and expanded significantly. They were great glassmakers and great businessmen. And art glass production here in New Bedford really thrived through the end of the century, and then into the 20th century. It actually closed in the 1950s. So it was about 100 years that glass was made here in New Bedford. Shirley was hired in the early 1870s. He was an Englishman, and they brought him over from, he was the head of a chandelier department in one of the big English factories, and ran that department here at the New Bedford, here in New Bedford. He was also a very astute businessman. He was renowned for his irascibility and feared by his competitors because he was very apt to litigation. He loved to really try to corner markets, and he was also a very savvy promoter. And so started in the early 1870s, became the agent of the company, which is essentially the highest administrative position. His boss of sorts was William Rotch Jr., who lived in the Arnold Mansion where we started. Rotch was one of the early original investors in the glass factory here. Rotch brought Thomas J. Pearpoint to New Bedford about 10 years later in about 1880 to start the Pearpoint silver plate manufacture. But Shirley was the genius, the early genius behind the glassworks here in New Bedford. We are fortunate where we're setting up the Glass Museum in the Arnold Mansion now, hoping to open later this summer, if we're allowed, which is very appropriate because, again, William J. Rotch lived there for a couple of decades, and he was the president of the company. We were given last year a Pearpoint stag. It's a bronze stag, measures about 30 inches tall, and we know that there are about 6 or 7 of these surviving. Frederick Shirley's family had one. So one of those stags was here, and we'll have another one in the mansion. But Shirley was a very important figure. As whaling was declining in the 1860s, the city was reinvesting in other industries, and glass was one of the real important ones. We have a photograph that was given to us by Frederick Shirley's granddaughter, dated 1903, that shows the dining room inside this house. It's dated to the day after this granddaughter's mother's wedding. So it shows the table set resplendently. There's a beautiful glass épergne, a big decorative centerpiece, which the family also donated to us. And I was in this house about 10 years ago, and you can go into that dining room, you see the mantelpiece, you see the little alcove to the right of it, and the window. It's really pretty much the same as when that photograph was taken. So it's a nice connection for us.
Welcome to the William Roach Rodman House, really one of the great mansions still standing in New Bedford, built in the 1830s. Mentioned William Rodman a little bit earlier, but he's not the man. The building of this house, style of the house, is not the actual subject of this particular MVP. He's a man by the name of Walter Langshore. And Walter Langshore didn't move into this house until 1919, actually. He's the last private owner of the building. When he left the house, when he died in 1947, it was the last time a family lived in the house. It's been owned and run by various educational, and now it's a commercial building that's been redeveloped. They've done a decent job of keeping lots of the original features, especially the great hallway. You can still see some of the grandeur and some of the offices. It's still a nice building. It's not as bad as you might think. It still has some of its antique charm on the inside. Anyway, Walter Langshore. He was born in 1858 in England and moved to the United States. He worked his family was textile mill owners in England. He moved to the United States, settled initially in the Lawrence and Lowell area, worked in the mills even as a youngster in the mills in Lawrence and Lowell. He decided to move to New Bedford around 1890 because New Bedford was really the new up-and-coming textile center in New England at the time. There were lots and lots of mill towns in the 1890s in all across New England. But New Bedford was new. There was new investment being brought here. All the capital from the whaling industry was finally flowing in on a regular basis into the textile industry's great growth. So it was a good idea for him to do so. He worked in a couple of mills and got involved with investors, and they built their own mill, the Dartmouth Mill. The Dartmouth Mill is the mill in the south end on Cove Street. Dartmouth Mill number 1 is the one with the big clock tower. The beautiful mill it's one of the most beautiful mills with the clock tower. A lot of the textile mills in New Bedford aren't terribly noteworthy for their architecture and features, but the mill number 1 at Dartmouth was still standing, is the one with the clock tower on Cove Street. All the mill buildings, there's a little road there between the Dartmouth Mill and the Hathaway Mill. It's called Harbor Road. Everything to the east of Harbor Road was the Dartmouth Mill, and everything to the west of Harbor Road was the Hathaway Mill. Eventually, the Hathaway Mill bought all those other things, but originally that was the story. The mill was organized in 1895, and Langshore eventually got really control of the mill. He was the agent treasurer of the mill. In the textile mill, if you were the treasurer, if you're listed as the treasurer of the mill, that means you were the head honcho. He was the man who ran the mill. He was the super. We would call that the superintendent, the president, CEO, whatever it might be. In those days, the treasurer was the man who ran the mill, and that's what he was. The agents in the mill were also the big job, but they were the guys that got jobs, farmed out jobs, made sure that there was product coming, product going. That was their specialty. But the treasurer ran the whole shebang, and that was Langshore's assumed that position at Dartmouth not long after the building was built. Langshore was a very flamboyant and maverick owner of the mills. I know that most of you probably don't know anything about football or the National Football League, but the way the mills were organized was sort of like a sports league. You had all these independent, wealthy people as the teams in the mills, and you had the commissioner of the mills was called the New Bedford Manufacturers Association. And the head of the New Bedford Manufacturers Association for 50 years was a Pierce. First it was Andrew Pierce Sr., and then it was Andrew Pierce Jr. And they set all the policy for the mills, wages, production, as much as they could. Now the individual mills succeeded or failed, or at their own competence. But basically they were subservient to a large degree to the New Bedford Manufacturers Association. That didn't sit well with Walter Langshore. Langshore was a heavy promoter of his own mill. The mill grew rapidly. It had a very, very large workforce. It had a very large capitalization by the 1920s, almost $4.5 million, one of the highest capitalizations of a mill in New Bedford. Only the Hathaway and Wamsutter and probably Nashawina were larger than Dartmouth. He was a heavy promoter of the mill, but he was always an outsider. And it grated on him, because really the New Bedford Manufacturing Association not only controlled the mills, but they controlled the banks as well. The same people were the board members of all the major banks. If you looked at the rosters of the board members in like 1920, they're all the same. The interlocking directorates was a real issue during this time. And Langshore was on the outside of that. He didn't like it at all. So the 1920s for the textile industry was not as successful as the rest of the country was doing. The Roaring 20s were a very boom time economically in the country. But that wasn't the case with the textile industry in New Bedford, because there were too many mills actually. And so in the late 1920s, the 1928, the New Bedford Manufacturers Association called for a 10% wage cut across the board for all the mills. And of course there was a major strike as a result. Only two of the cotton mills, did not go along with the wage cut. One of them, the Beacon Manufacturing Company, they had a totally different business model. They almost don't count. But the other one was the Dartmouth Mill. Walter Langshore decided he wasn't going to cut wages. He was going to, in his mind, I think he was kind of sticking it to the rest of the New Bedford Manufacturers Association. The strike droned on. It was very destructive. You had basically 30,000 employees on strike. 30,000 employees out of work. So by the middle of the summer, people are running out of food. They're not paying their rents. Small businesses and all the supply, because this is a major, 30,000 employees, that's probably, how many families? Was that 80,000 people really, So the strike was really crippling the city. Well, in August, the strike goes on, in August of 1928, strike's going nowhere, settlement's going nowhere. Langshore publishes this diatribe in the Standard Times about the condition of the mills, and he just rips them. He names names. He calls people out. He says that he calls people who are incompetent. They should close mills. He names the names the mills that should be closed. He names people who should be thrown out. It's unbelievable, really. It was like, maybe some of it was true, but he says, these people are overpaid. And he doesn't just say these people. He says Joe Blow and Sally and all these other people. Outrageous, really. It's amazing he wasn't sued for it. But he was just so outside the loop, as it turns out, that it didn't matter. All the things he said just didn't matter. But it was an amazing article. When you read it today, you just can't believe that anybody could come out with something like that. But that was who he was. And so eventually, the strike is settled. they settled for a 5% wage cut, but he was right in some respects. There were too many mills. There was too much production citywide. It couldn't sustain itself. The South had been developing a large textile industry since the years after the Civil War and Reconstruction. That was the business that they decided to invest in, and they were very successful in doing so. And by the time the 1920s came, and New England always had a little bit of an edge on the South for quantity and quality, but by the 1920s, the South had caught up. They were producing just as good a product, just as much of a product, and basically at 30% less labor costs. So New Bedford was really on the edge of failing. Now, the strike is settled in the fall of 1928, but 1 year later, the stock market crashes and the textile industry in New Bedford and New England, but in New Bedford, completely crashes. All the mills, as it turns out, that Langshore identified that should be closed right away failed almost immediately. But then as the Depression went on and on, one by one, the mills failed, one by one, until of the 30 major corporations that existed in New Bedford in 1929, just before the stock market crash, only 9 survived the Great Depression. And the Dartmouth Mill was one of the earliest mills. Langshore decided he had no hope. He liquidated the mill, which probably meant he just gave up because there was no assets that were worth anything. He originally had $4.5 million of capitalization in the mill. It probably was worth less than $100,000 by the time he liquidated the mill in 1933. If it wasn't for the Great Depression, textiles would have petered out like whaling did. Mills would have dropped off year after year, but it wouldn't have been the massive loss, because really you had close to 25,000 jobs that disappeared forever in a very short amount of time in the city. It was a disaster. New Bedford has never really recovered from that, because the population of the city at the time of the Great Depression was 120,000. And it's only declined to what it is today, like low 90s, I think it is, the population of New Bedford. Anyway, he stayed in the house. I think he actually died. It was late 80s by the time Langshore died in 1947. I think he was living in either Brookline or Newton at the time, but he was probably living with a relative or something, because he still owned the house when he died in 1947, and the house was sold after that, and it was never a private home again. The last property on the tour. On this block, which includes Cottage, Grove, Orchard, and Hawthorne, there was one magnificent estate. I'm going to talk about that estate, but there's 2 people I want to mention in regard to this estate. One of them is Conrad Aiken. Conrad Aiken was an American poet born in 1889 in Savannah, Georgia, died in 1973 in Savannah, Georgia. He was a Pulitzer Prize-winning poet in 1930. He was a poet laureate of the United States in 1950, 51, and 52. It wasn't called poet laureate back then, but it was the same position at the Library of Congress. They call it that now. They sort of stole the name from the English. Anyway, he was a well-known poet in his day. Went to Harvard. One of his good friends was lifelong friends as well as classmates was T.S. Eliot. And he had a connection to New Bedford. The other person I want to talk about is the owner of this particular house. Her name was Julia Delano. Julia Delano was the spinster daughter of Joseph Delano. Delano was a merchant sea captain, made a lot of money, was a protege and employee actually of Joseph Grinnell as a sea captain. And when the Wamsutta Mill was being organized, Grinnell had a difficult time finding investors. So he went to Joseph Delano, you know, his friend and neighbor, because they lived pretty close to one another. And Delano came up with probably the $20,000 buy-in for an investment in the Wamsutta Mill. It was about the best thing that ever happened to Delano, and particularly Julia Delano, because they were, that $20,000 investment set them up forever. They built a beautiful house on this site. It was originally a Greek Revival mansion, looked pretty much like the other Greek Revivals in town, like the Grinnell and the Rotch Rodman house. Delano purchased the property around 1840 when Joseph Anthony, the original builder of the house, died. And around 1850, he remodeled the house completely. And it was a magnificent French Second Empire. So how do these two people coincide? Conrad Aiken was born in 1889. His parents were William Aiken and Anna Potter, who was from New Bedford. Her relatives were the Kemptons and the Delanos. They moved to, he was a physician. They moved to Savannah, Georgia. They had 4 children. And in the late 1890s, Dr. Aiken started to act very, very irrationally and violently. And in 1900, with the kids in the house, he murdered his wife and shot himself. So we had four children left alone. There was a family in Savannah named Taylor who took the 3 young ones. Julia Delano traveled as quickly as she could to Savannah, Georgia, and picked up Conrad as an 11-year-old. Brought him to New Bedford. He lived in New Bedford. He didn't live at the house here, but he lived in the Kempton house on Union Street, the old Austin Carney Funeral Home. Beautiful building still. It's not a funeral home anymore. It's 549 County Street. It's been beautifully restored, actually. That was where he lived. And for 2 or 3 years, he stayed there, and they sent him to boarding school when he was about 13, went to Harvard, and his career blossomed. But he wrote 2 autobiographical novels, one in 1929 and one in the 1950s. And he talks about his time in New Bedford, poignantly, actually. He doesn't refer to the people by name. He calls Julia Aunt Maud, and he calls Kempton Aunt Jane, but that's who he was referring to. And one of the things that he says about them, about Julia, she was an eccentric, clearly. She was very, you know, she probably just was strong-willed rather than anything else, you know. Julia was her famous, the best story about Julia is that she was anxious to finally register to vote. She didn't die until 1936. She was born in 1848, died in 1936. So when women got the vote in 1920, she was anxious to register. She goes down to the city hall to register. First thing they ask her is, how old is she? She walks out the door. She walks out the door. She wouldn't give up her name and to register to vote. Apparently Julia was the last person in town with a 4-horse carriage and a footman as well. But the house, as described in the novel in 1953, was called Ushant, U-S-H-A-N-T, by Conrad Aiken, autobiographical novel. He describes the house here in New Bedford at this site as, you know, it's grand mansion, beautiful, beautiful grounds. Apparently, I've never seen a picture. I've seen a picture of the house. I haven't seen a picture of the carriage house. He said an architectural treasure was the carriage house. Never saw a picture of it. Anyway, he describes all these buildings. And the odd thing about this particular building is on the 3rd floor, there was a 3rd floor added. It was a mansard roof mansion, a stone mansard roof mansion. The 3rd floor was a marble floored gymnasium. It had all the equipment of a gym. This was in around 1900 when he lived here. Rings, parallel bars, the whole thing. So what is this doing here, you know? No one went up there to use it, apparently, by the time he was there.
3rd floor, marble?
3rd floor, marble floored gymnasium, yep. And anyway, that's the type of things he talks about. The other interesting detail he talks about, he lived at the Kempton House, and even in 1900, they had livestock, cows and so forth. And every day, the servants would walk the cows out to Buttonwood so they could graze all day, and then at night they would bring them back.
That'd be a nice walk.
Yep. Now Buttonwood wasn't a park; it was a meadow and a field at the time. It was part of it was city owned, part of what is Buttonwood Park now was actually owned by Hetty Green. She owned all the land on the other side of Rockdale Avenue, from about halfway in the park to all the way towards the cemetery, probably even the cemetery. There's another mansion that's long gone up on County Street, on Hawthorne Street, where the Jewish convalescent home is now. And I did a little work on that house as well. And he did the same thing. He had a special entrance for his livestock to either drive them to market downtown or drive them to, or have the servants bring them to the Buttonwood Park so they could graze all day in the summertime. So anyway, Aiken really portrays New Bedford in both. The other novel is called The Blue Voyage, 1929. And in The Blue Voyage, this is the closeout, he has this great line, which I'll repeat. And his line from The Blue Voyage about New Bedford was, "Miserable child who has no cupola for his rainy mornings." I just love that too. I just love that. Anyway, Aiken had a strong soft spot in his heart for New Bedford. He ended up living his last few years in Savannah, and he died in 1973. His gravesite is a granite bench, and that granite bench, if you remember the movie Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil, it was set as a murder mystery in Savannah, and that bench is actually featured in the at certain scenes in that movie. It's the gravesite of Conrad Aiken. That concludes today's tour. Thank you for coming.